to do today really is sort of throw some ideas at you that are mostly stuff about green economics, and then some stuff that I think about Swindon, so it's probably all totally wrong, you can tell me that. But what I would like us to do together is try and imagine Swindon playing its part in a green economy of the future. Obviously that's easier for you to do than it is for me to do, partly because you're in Swindon and I'm in Stroud. So Stroud, I mean, I live in Stroud because it's easy to imagine Stroud having a green future, and I don't find it as easy with Swindon. And you know, that's something I think, that's why I want to get a crack on and say what I've got to say so we can have that conversation together really. Okay, let's go for the first one, see what it looks like. Oh yeah, so there's a few, is it going? Yeah. There's a few slides that are just kind of where we are in terms of the economy. And this is actually quite an amazing slide, you know, from an economics point of view, from an economist's point of view, that's an extraordinarily bad, in conventional economic terms, view of what's happening with the economy. I mean, if you think that the bars, here we go back to 2007, wow, what a boom we were having, yeah? And then it's coming right down here. But if you think about averaging the ones that are above the line with the ones below the line, you can see that going back to 2007, we've basically been on a flat line. And capitalist economies don't do that. They grow. And when they don't grow, you end up with all sorts of problems, which is why we're in the mess we're in, basically. So, but on the other hand, from a green point of view, this is what the economy's been doing since the end of the Second World War. And if you look at that extraordinary growth trajectory and you think of the implications of that in terms of resource use and in terms of energy use and in terms of carbon emissions, you see why I'm asking the question, well, maybe arresting growth isn't such a bad thing after all.
So what's the graphical axis then?
It's basically GDP over time. Yeah, so it's like economic activity. That's how economic growth is usually measured, increase in GDP. I mean, we could spend a long time talking about whether that's a good measure of economic activity, but that's the sort of conventional measure, and that's what the economy's done. So you can see the little recessions we've had. You can see that this was quite a striking recession, but even since then, the economy's sort of starting to go up again. So, and from my perspective, one of the pieces of work I'm trying to do at the moment is to ask this question, well, was growth ever such a good thing anyway? And what are the implications of living in an economy that's gone beyond this growth stage? Is there some way of achieving stability? How does that relate to sustainability? And what implications does it have in terms of how what is generated by this economy is shared out? So that takes me on to this report called Prosperity Without Growth, which some of you may have read. It was written in 2008 by Tim Jackson. He was at the time Sustainable Development Commissioner, and yeah, it was quite interesting because he produced a report saying maybe economic growth wasn't such a good thing, and then the Sustainable Development Commission was rapidly abolished. I mean, we did have a change of government as well, so there wasn't necessarily a causal link there. But this was quite a dramatic moment because it was somebody pretty much in the mainstream seriously challenging this idea that what economies are supposed to do is carry on growing. And the point he was making, which is actually an obvious point, is that you can't go on growing forever. You know, we're living within a finite planet. There's got to be some point at which growth stops. And yeah, it's amazing, I think, that you have to make that argument, but you do have to make that argument, and it's almost always rejected by conventional economists. And they have a lot of kind of explanations for why that's not the case. So anyway, it was refreshing to see that, and it was also refreshing because what he went on to talk about afterwards is what economics should be about. And so his conclusion was that we should be focusing on better rather than more, and he focuses on this idea of flourishing within limits. So it's much more about quality of life rather than the sort of amount of stuff that we've got. And that's where my next slide comes in, you know. Basically, what kind of people are we and what kind of society do we have when we focus so much on materialism? And again, this isn't an old argument. You know, both these arguments have been around for sort of 30 years. But a lot of people are gaining significantly in terms of power and their own personal prestige from this kind of growth system. And therefore, they're very reluctant to accept that it should change. And as I see it, the point we're at now is this kind of real battle between the vision we have of what the economy is for, whether it is all about more growth, materialism, or whether it's actually about relationships, satisfaction and quality of life. And in a way, the failure of growth gives us an interesting opportunity to ask those questions in a different kind of way. And the financial crisis, which is obviously part of that. Right, I've got two rather techie slides now, which come from that report, but which I wanted to sort of explain because I think they set the context for thinking about how a green economy might work. Now, quite often, if you suggest that climate change means you've got to stop growing and you've got to stop producing more, then people that are in favour of the conventional system will come back and say, oh, it's fine, what we're going to do is we're just going to produce stuff more efficiently. We're just going to find ways of producing the same amount of stuff using less energy. Or actually they say 4 times as much stuff with half the energy or something like this. So this is a graph that actually shows you what's been achieved in terms of energy efficiency. So we start at 1980 and we go over to 2005 over there. This, just as well, I've shown this one before so I can read it. Kilograms of carbon dioxide per dollar of output is what it's measuring. So it's showing you how efficiently you can produce stuff of economic value. And as you can see, most of the economies of the world actually have already reached pretty much their maximum efficiency. Even though there's big pressure to achieve greater efficiency, the rates are going down only very slowly. There's the black line, that's the world. There's the purple line, that's the US. The UK is the blue line there. They're all kind of slightly decreasing in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide they're producing, but only slightly. China, by contrast, makes an impressive reduction in the carbon dioxide per unit of output, per dollar's worth of output in the early years. But you can see, even in the case of China, that's levelled off. It's achieved the sort of easy wins in terms of energy efficiency of production. And at the end of the graphic here, it's actually starting to increase. So those arguments are not backed up by the evidence. We are not achieving the kind of efficiencies that we need to. Now, I've got nothing against energy efficiency. I think we need to, part of what the changes we need to make is much more focus on that, different kinds of design, so we're focused on energy efficiency rather than profitability. But, even though there's been a lot of attention to that, we haven't really achieved very much. And the next slide actually shows you the extraordinary amounts that we need to achieve. This is really going to test me now, isn't it? Can I see these numbers? I know that one says 768 and that one says about 32 or something. Anyway, this graphic has got even more information in it. It's my last complex one, I promise. So what it's showing is the efficiency with which you can produce economic output again. And this is grams of carbon dioxide per dollar's worth of output. So on a world basis in 2007 it's 768. To produce $1 worth of output takes 768 grams of carbon dioxide. And then what he's doing here, this is work by Tim Jackson, again from Prosperity Without Growth. Then what he's doing here is checking out for different scenarios how much extra efficiency you need to achieve in order to get to the sort of the world as he's portraying it. So his assumptions are things like 9 billion people or 11 billion people, so assuming there's going to be population increase. And he also makes the assumption that everybody in the world has the right to the same lifestyle. So in these projections, he's looking at a lifestyle like the one we have now, a lifestyle and level of consumption that's as energy intensive as the way we live now. And if you compare what we achieve now on a world basis, 768 grams, and this third scenario is the one I usually use, and I think it's like 128-fold reductions, or rather improvements in efficiency to get to a position where you've got 9 billion people all living at the lifestyle we've got now. So that doesn't mean just doubling your efficiency or trebling your efficiency, it means 828-fold improvements in efficiency. Now, I think in this physical universe that is not feasible myself. We're not getting anywhere near that. So we're making assumptions that we're going to find some amazing energy source that we had never thought about, or that we can continue to live the high life and other people couldn't be in poverty, or some of those things. Once you eliminate those kinds of hidden assumptions, this is the kind of efficiency improvements you're looking at, and they're just really nowhere on the horizon at the moment. Okay, so that's kind of technical reasons why we need to think about the economy in a different way. Now this is more in terms of just our own security, really. This is I think this is Avon Math. I always forget to put on mini to try and reduce my interesting. So I went to Rotterdam, so I saw an extraordinary port, 50 kilometres across, and it's actually only the 4th largest port in the world. It's just actually sickening. You actually feel physically sick by the kind of speed and vastness of it. It's extraordinary. And that's the kind of system we're all living with now, the kind of massive growth. And of course, as I say here, it's a system of massive energy intensity, very long supply chains. So, if the ship breaks down in the English Channel in November, we have to cancel Christmas because everything for Christmas was on that ship. This is actually true. Well, Christmas is made in China and imported, well, probably October actually July probably. Anyway, if the ship breaks down, we don't get Christmas. I mean, that is the way that we're dependent now on manufacturing inside the world. So that has these implications in terms of energy, but it also has very important implications in terms of the sort of community we've got. You know, we used to live in a community where you were the person that made the shoes, I was the person that made the chairs. We knew each other through those relationships. And this global trade system is causing those sort of breakdowns as well, and loss of identity. So we're all now the person that sits in front of a computer or not. And what we identify ourselves more in terms of going shopping than by what we produce. Right, I've got a few more slightly scary statistics about trade and the trading system. Because I'm sure, you know, you get frustrated about the amount of food that we import that we could actually be growing here. But the slightly more worrying thing of that is that 99% of food imports actually depend on the world's ports. And if we go to the next slide here, this is a completely obvious thing that nobody ever thinks about. Once I started realising this, I looked up in the academic literature, and there's one paper making this point, that the trade system depends on ports. And the first thing that's happening already with climate change is that sea level is rising. And where are all the world's ports? Well, they're all at sea level, aren't they? It's extraordinary, because we're so dependent on that system, and yet it is so lacking in resilience. So if we just go back to the previous slide, you know, the data here, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, predicted 1/3 of a metre rise in sea levels by the end of this century in 2007. By 2009, they were saying that already it was happening twice as fast as they expected because of feedbacks from melting ice and so on. So anyway, this is all totally unpredictable. But what is known, and what is obvious, is that we are relying on ports to import a lot of our food. And actually, most of the ports are in southeast of England, which are very vulnerable to flooding. And also, as you know, the country's doing this. So it's just, it feels like a very easy system. So when I started thinking, I'm not saying that this is how Swindon is, incidentally, but when I started thinking about modelling the way our resource systems work and whether we could apply this to Swindon, I started thinking about this idea that we came up with, which is the vision of Petropolis. He starts off with Acropolis, which is a kind of medieval kind of system, and then he says as we move towards this system that's what he calls Petropolis. And this is really what I've been talking about, a system that relies on fossil fuels. It wouldn't be possible to live in this way without fossil fuels, because we're using that energy to move all the stuff around. And oh no, these ones I don't know what, I mean, we can more or less see what they are. So, you know, fuels this whole system. Here's going large distances across the world. And here's us all sort of flying around the world as well. There's the supermarkets. So it's a system of large amounts of movement in and out of these big centres, and very heavily dependent on fossil fuel. So what he proposes instead is this idea of the ecopolis. And this is probably not news to anybody here, you know, it's just a different way of it. It's much more like a market town kind of model. You have the centre where people live, the settlement centre in the middle, and then as you go out, the things that you need to provide for your lifestyle are found in the ground, which minimises the amount of transport, obviously. So here you've got the sort of market gardens where you grow your food. Further out you've got food and fuel crops. As further you've got the area that you use to produce your energy supplies. And then you've got grazing and forestry at the furthest level out. So this is a way of visioning the relocalisation of production that would give us much greater security, I think, and also reduce our dependence on fossil fuel. Because the way we live now has just developed as a consequence of having freely available and abundant fossil fuels. And if we think of the world beyond that, then it's going to have to look much more like this. So then I started thinking, well, you know, about Swindon. How does Swindon fit into this model? And actually, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Swindon's here because of the railways. So I think it's here precisely because of all these movements that started happening in Victorian times. So in a way, you can see it as a classic example of a fossil fuel town. It's got these transport networks. You know, I've come on the train, I'm going to go back on the train. I think it is the country's first railway city, isn't it? Railway town. What's the other one? York, because York was there previously.
Derby, possibly?
Yeah, possibly. But, you know, it's at the intersection of railways, and so it developed into a town because of that. And that was a new thing. That was a thing that happened with the industrial age. So, yes, I mean, it's relied on that model. Originally, that's where the employment came from, and more recently, it's relied on attracting in large companies, well, you know, Honda, Nationwide, Intel, companies like that that are now providing employment. So you're not relying on what's here locally to provide employment. You're relying on companies coming in and bringing those jobs with them, or the system of transportation in itself. Some data about Swindon. Quite interesting. I mean, maybe you knew that. I didn't know that. Swindon's population has increased by 12% since 2001. So between the last census and this census, its population has increased more than that of the southwest of England. I suppose that's the result of the boom, the M4 corridor kind of effect. Wages are quite high, 26,900. I mean, it's not a huge salary, but it's larger than the average in the southwest or in England. Unemployment rate, the latest unemployment rate is 7.1%, so although that's higher than the southwest average, it's lower than the England average. The southwest average is probably lower because a lot of people are retired. You know, we have a very large number of retired people in the population of the southwest as a whole, living in Bournemouth and Dawlish and places like that. So that probably affects that data. And interestingly, I think this last one was interesting to me. It has a low percentage of workers qualified to degree level. So the lowest percentage of workers with NVQ, so degree level education, the lowest of all unitary and county authorities in the southwest. So that tells you the kind of work people have been doing, and it's probably been skilled manual work, because those are the kind of jobs that fit people like that. So that's interesting. If we're starting to think, well, what can we do in Swindon to create green jobs and to think about its green economy, you know, it's useful to know the kind of people we've got here at the moment. And so that made me think, well, you know, we've got certain kinds of industries here, but if we're going to create an economy that provides for its own needs, then we're going to need different kinds of industries. And what we should be undergoing in this country is this process of industrial conversion. So moving beyond the kind of high energy, industrialised industries of the 19th century really, and also the 20th century, into these kind of manufacturing areas that are the direction we're moving in. Manufacturing wind turbines. Nobody in the country manufactures wind turbines. Every single one has to be imported. But you know, the kind of skills that have been found in Swindon up to now, I think could be transferred into these kinds of areas if there was some kind of government investment, some kind of policy decision to do that. And another argument that I'm making, because I'm studying the European elections, is about the need to shift European funding. So at the moment, depressed areas of Europe get funding through the convergence programme, but that funding might build airports, it might do all sorts of things that are completely inconsistent with other policies that the EU is espousing. So one of the things we're going to be arguing in the campaign is the need to shift the emphasis of European funding to developing the green economy. And I've framed this in terms of these ecological enterprise zones as areas where, you know, there'd be special areas which were given particular benefits and advantages, but in return were supposed to provide good performance in terms of environmental indicators. Some research from the European Environmental Bureau found that actually, it's the previous one still, that if you shifted the European investment towards green sectors, you would get 3 times as many jobs for your money. Because actually the kind of big infrastructure projects that they tend to fund are not very labour intensive after the initial period, so they're not actually very good at creating jobs. This is another point I think is important, the fact that the economy we're moving towards is going to be one where we don't have this disposable approach. We're not constantly throwing things away. So what that means is we're going to need people with manual skills, technical skills to mend things. So, you know, mending cars rather than throwing them away. ELV, End-of-Life Vehicle Directive, is something very useful that came from Europe, which said that the car, once it's manufactured, always belongs to the manufacturer and they are responsible for the costs of disposal. So that immediately blocks off the process of throwaway society, and the WE Directive does a similar thing for electronic goods. So it creates an incentive for people to keep things for longer and to actually mend them rather than throw them away. We've already got apparently 77,000 low carbon and environmental jobs in the southwest, and it's interesting. I think if you compare, you know, people in Swindon I'm sure would say, oh, nobody wants green economy, what would happen to Honda? But actually the green economy is already responsible for a lot more jobs than the motor trades. Financial services is actually a huge employer in the southwest, and telecommunications, I don't know, that must be the 3rd largest one. I mean, this is an interesting one. I'm sure it's declined since then, but that's an interesting point. You've got nationwide headquarters here, I think, haven't you? So I'm sure that's bringing a lot of high skill well-paid jobs into Swindon. You know, I would say that being the nationwide, it should be encouraged. I'm not sure what I'd think if it was Santander or somebody, but anyway, it's obviously another big employer here. But I think this is a large figure. I was certainly surprised to see that many people were already working in the green economy, because we're kind of at the beginning of this process really, so we can expect to generate a lot more jobs. A couple of slides kind of coming on from my support for nationwide and for a mutual approach to economic life, sort of cooperative approach. There's some really interesting research being done by Andy Cumbers of Glasgow University looking at the amazing boom in wind power in Denmark. Why has wind power taken off in Denmark compared to the slow progress in this country? And his explanation is very much in terms of how the wind power industry is actually owned, because it's very largely cooperatively owned. So people, instead of saying, oh, that spoils my view, I don't want to have that, they have a buy-in and immediate sort of ownership, a genuine ownership of the wind turbine. They either get money back or they get free energy. So, you know, the opposition is just minimal, actually. And in addition, it was very heavily supported by the government with subsidies, consistent subsidies. Let's just point out how there's the subsidies, there's the feed-in tariff being introduced. You can see how absolutely it takes off. There's a Conservative government getting elected, ending the feed-in tariff, and that's the tail again. So, well, it's not surprising. You offer people money to do something, they do it. You know? I think the next slide will tell us the kind of policies they introduced. Yeah, high and consistent feed-in tariff. Distance regulation and consumption laws. So that means you have the energy that's produced has to be consumed within a certain distance rather than transported in order to get the highest rates of the feed-in tariff. So again, you know, if you decide what it is you want to do, you can work out a policy to do that, and it does work. And here you can see the level of cooperative ownership. 84% of turbines are actually owned by cooperatives, and 12% of everybody who lives in Denmark owns some proportion of a wind farm, which is quite impressive statistics, I think. Right, so we've done energy, let's have a little think about food, because that was the other thing when I started thinking about Swindon. I think, yeah, well, you're right there in the middle of a load of really high quality agricultural land, right? It's not something you think about Swindon, but actually it is the case. As a whole, in Wiltshire as a whole, 72% of the land is currently farmed, but I'm not quite sure how many people, even in this room, are able to get most of the food that they eat from local supply. You know, it's that kind of connection with the land and the food and people's diets that's really broken down. And this is another way we can obviously reduce carbon emissions, increase our resilience, and generate jobs all at the same time. So we've got the triple win here. Just looking at what the land's actually used for, a quarter of it is used for arable, nearly 40% is used for grazing, which is kind of the lowest level of land use really, producing animals that you then eat, and terribly land intensive. Whereas if we look at horticulture, it's just 4% of the land of Wiltshire. So basically we're not growing vegetables, and there are various reasons for that, but you know, I think that really should be a target. If we're talking about developing the green economy, we should be thinking about ways to ensure that the local land here starts to feed people who live in Swindon. Making local food work just refers to that because it's a big project that was funded by the lottery. It's still going on to some extent, but it's very supportive of more local food production for local consumption, and they don't actually quantify, but they do talk about the huge potential to increase local food production from sale. Okay, that's it. There's a few options, a few thoughts and possibilities. So please get stuck in. Tell me everything I got wrong about Swindon and everything else you know about Swindon.